Part of, I think, the interest of being here at FUCamp was to bridge various worlds, and clearly getting out of the ivory tower is always a good thing. So let me talk about a few things that I face and what I think are challenges in reproducibility. I'll briefly mention why we even should care about reproducibility. Take it from me, I'm a data editor. We've done reproducibility and data provenance checks for 1,000 papers in the past 2 years since when we started this. I can talk at length about the entire workflow. We do this for 8 journals. They cover a broad swath of economics. It's only economics, so take that with a grain of salt. But some of the things that we come up with that are a challenge to reproducibility and more generally transparency and credibility of the academic research that's published there is, where does the data come from? Data provenance in the terms of the trade. It matters for credibility overall. Here's a bunch of bytes. Trust me, this is right. It is not exactly the right response that it should be, but that still is too much of the case. It requires a lot of prodding of authors who have already gone through the entire review cycle. So it's both a question of authors as well as reviewers not pressing too much on that. It's not particularly unique to economics. I talk a lot with computer scientists, and they very often use the quote-unquote adult data set. And you need to be a computer scientist to understand what that is. It has a very well-defined provenance of where they get it from, but nobody really knows how it got generated. And so how relevant testing algorithms on the adult data set is a valid question. And I might want to sort of point at academics here as well. Often when we do get papers that come from professional economists in consulting companies or Federal Reserves or central banks, they are much more worried about documenting where they got the data from because they need to worry about copyright infringement and getting sued for things like that. Apparently, academics don't care too much about that. The second is, how do folks get the data? Very different problem. You figured out where you got the data from, but in so many different cases, this is an extraordinarily manual process. And that's a problem because it introduces barriers for others to reproduce and or extend and replicate the work that you're doing. I just reviewed a paper today that had about 18 different data sources, all of which were downloaded by hand, all of which are accessible through an API, and yet very few economists use those kinds of APIs. Okay. Part of the reason is that there are very few APIs in the social science world, and that's something to think about. So the third challenge is a capability challenge. Social scientists, technical term, suck as programmers. So the way that authors tell you how you should run the code is revealing of how they ran the code. And often this is quite frustrating because if you're supposed to do it again, it's time consuming. And it's really a hurdle on scientific advancement to some extent, because you can imagine that if it takes me, once they've cleaned it all up, a lot of time to run stuff, it probably took them even longer. And yet there are so many ways to do that more efficiently. So there's an education challenge here in terms of getting back to social scientists. What are the right ways of doing this? Now, that is typically not a problem for social scientists in the industry. When there are, say, like Neil's economists working at big data companies, they learn pretty fast that that's no longer an excuse to run things this way. But in academia, this seems to be relatively pervasive. It generally is not that it's wrong, it's just that it's inefficient, okay? Finally, much data has high transaction costs. So I already mentioned that it's not accessible through APIs, but confidential data is also an issue. There are solutions to all those things. It's not per se a structural problem, but it is a time and human cost of accessing data that is preventing general reproducibility. So in general, talk to me. I'm interested in solutions. We are putting out there some. And if you want to look up more on me, that's there. And that's it.